خانم آقایان، شب بر شما خوش. به 102مین نشست کانون کتاب تورنتو خوش اومدید. همونطور که میدونید امشب خانم دکتر پرسیس کریم در مورد ادبیات ایرانیان آمریکایی برای ما صحبت میکنن. این سخنرانی به زبان انگلیسی خواهد بود. چند تا نکته رو من خدمت شما میگم و بعد خانم دکتر کریم شروع میکنن. اولا این برنامه با همکاری بنیاد مطالعات ایرانی در دانشگاه تورنتو برگزار میشه. از دوست عزیزم آقای دکتر توکلی سپاسگزاری میکنم که با ما همکاری میکنن در برگزاری این برنامه ها. نشست بعدی ما جمعه 13 نوامبر هست. دکتر احمد کریمی عکاک صحبت میکنن در مورد تجدد و ادبیات. کمک‌های مالی خودتون رو برای ما بگذارین لطفاً. بدون کمک‌های مالی شما برگزاری این نشست‌ها امکان پذیر نیست. ضمناً برگ ایمیل ها دست به دست میگرده. دوستانی که علاقه‌مند هستن خبرهای کانون کتاب تورنتو رو دریافت کنن ایمیلاتون رو برای ما بگذارید و لطف کنید در طول سخنرانی تلفن‌ها و فکس و دستگاه الکترونیکتون رو خاموش کنید. نهایتاً اینکه برای برگزاری این شب‌ها و ضمناً و دیجیتایز فیلم سخنرانی‌ها و صدای سخنرانی‌ها و بازسازی وبسایت کانون کتاب به همکاری داوطلبین احتیاج هست. اگر علاقه‌مند هستین پس از پایان سخنرانی با من صحبت کنیم، با هم دیگه قرار بگذاریم. دو تا از کتاب‌های خانم دکتر کریم هم بیرون هست. دوستان میتونن تهیه کنن و پس از پایان سخنرانی ایشون امضا خواهند کرد. مجموعه ایران نامه هم هست بیرون. اشتراک سالانه $100 و کسانی که مشترک بشن یک سری از شماره‌های گذشته که اینجا موجود هست میتونن مجانا داشته باشن. از توجهتون سپاسگزارم. من فقط یک معرفی کوتاهی از خانم دکتر کریم خواهم گفت و ایشون شروع میکنن. Dr. Persis Karim is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at San Jose State University. She teaches literature, creative writing, and Middle East studies. She is the editor of 3 anthologies of Iranian diaspora literature: Tremors, New Fiction by Iranian American Writers in 2013, Let Me Tell You Where I've Been, New Writing by Women of Iranian Diaspora, 2006. These 2 books are outside. And A World Between, Poems, Short Stories, and Essays by Iranian Americans in 1999. She has written numerous articles about the literature and culture of Iranian diaspora and has co-edited several journals in the subject of Iranian diaspora studies. She is also founding director in Persian Studies program at San Jose State University. Thank you very much, Dr. Persis. Please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Merci, kheli mamnoon. I want to say thank you to Dr. Tavakoli for inviting me to come tonight. He's doing great work. I'm sure you all know about his work on Iranian American, but also his work in trying to create and build an Iranian studies program here in Toronto is really important. So I'm glad that you all are collaborating. It's such a great time for us to be doing Iranian studies. Mohammed and I were talking in the car about both the historic opportunity we have today with the P5+1 agreement, but also there's so many young scholars now who are doing work on Iran. So I hope you'll support him in his efforts to institutionalize Iranian studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done over the past 2.5 decades, and I'm going to share with you some literature. It's all in English. I hope you enjoy it as much as you enjoy, I'm sure, hearing Persian poetry in Persian. I grew up in the United States the daughter of an Iranian father who came to the U.S. in 1946, and my mother was from France, and she came in 1947. So my connection to Iran and Iranian culture was really formed after 1979, when I suddenly realized how much I didn't know about Iran and how much more I wanted to know. So unlike people who fled their Persian identity after 79 in the US, I actually wanted to go towards it. So I started learning more about Iran and took Persian classes, and then eventually did a master's degree and a PhD at the University of Texas in comparative literature. And so I'm not fluent at all in Persian, but you could say that I'm a diasporic Iranian wannabe, meaning I never left Iran, but I've always wanted to be more connected to it, and I've come back to it through literature. So my journey as a writer and poet and editor and scholar of Iranian diaspora literature in some ways was really born out of that personal quest for connection to Iran and Iranian culture. When I was 13 years old, my father went to Iran and brought me back a Gugush record, and it was a 45, some of you remember 45 records. And I remember listening to Gugush, and I was so touched by it that I knew then that I was going to find my way to Iran and Iranian culture through Gugush. My work as a literary scholar really grew out of my experience of doing a PhD. I started taking Persian classes, and I started reading modern Iranian literature. And then, of course, I read some works by writers who had left Iran after 1979. And I was really struck by how much the experience of writers of exile resonated with me and some of my feelings of being outside of American culture, because I hadn't ever felt fully American. So I ended up writing a dissertation about exilic writers in the 20th century, and that included Iranians. And while I was doing that work, I started meeting more and more Iranians who either came from Iran as children or young adults, or people like me who were the product of a marriage between an Iranian and a non-Iranian. And I realized that we had stories also to tell. So when my last year of graduate school, I had a friend who was from Iran. He had left Iran. He had a UN passport because he had left. He was a political person. And he and I talked about this idea that there was this kind of really interesting generation of people who were born in Iran and had left as children, and also were coming to the US as students, and that there was probably some really interesting literature that was yet to be born. So we decided to send out a call for submissions, and the first anthology I edited, A World Between, came out of that in 1999. And that, I was telling Saeed and Mohammed at dinner that one of the things that was so interesting about that first book was that Iranians had a sense of urgency about telling their story. And when I say Iranian American, I include Canadians because I'm not a snob. It is North America. But most of the people I had contact with were in the United States. And so the writing was really reflecting that first movement out of Iran and that first sensibility of loss and rupture that came after the revolution, and then for other people through the war between Iran and Iraq. So I'm just going to read you a couple poems from that first collection so you can hear a little bit what people were writing. This is a poem by a young woman who's now about 27 years old, but at the time she was 13, and she's an incredibly accomplished poet. But I found her poem so compelling that I put it in that first collection, and at the time she was only 13 years old. And it's called My Father's Shoes. They were my father's shoes. My mother looked at them and saw a donation to Goodwill. My father looked at them and saw his life. They were with him on the last step on his home country. They were with him when he first saw me. They kissed the dirt of the land of opportunity. My mother looks at them and sees dust collectors. My father sees his first day at work. He sees his graduation. He sees the hard work it took to get those shoes. My mother looks at them and sees things that take up extra space. I don't look at the shoes. My father's face says it all. So the experience of exile and departure, I think, was very much a prominent theme in some of the first generation of writers who had either been born or raised in Iran and were sending me their stuff. Another poem I want to read you is from a young scholar named Laleh Khalili, who's in the UK now. It's called In Exile. Azizam, shamefaced I am, just shamefaced. The other day, you know, I denied being yours. I denied being you. I denied it all. The other day, I had to learn to unlearn you. The other day, Azizam, how does one recount a story in a language no one seems to understand? There are times when you want to be a profusion of myths, when you know that dormant histories lie unassumingly in the forgotten subcutaneous region of your rib cage. There are times when you just want to declare yourself in joy, in pride, even, and you can't. The Esperanto of screaming or laughter or sorrow or rage, raising of eyebrows or lowering of eyelids all have different meanings here, and you know you will be misconstrued, and you know that you will be misunderstood, and you know you will be ridiculed. Azizam, what can one do when one protects the fragile genealogy of an entire history? What can one do? Shamefaced I am, Azizam, just shamefaced. So those two poems I just read to you are from that first collection, and in general, the poetry and nonfiction and fiction that came out of that first wave of writing between about 1990 and 2000 really was the sort of the aftermath of people leaving Iran or coming to grips with what Iran meant. In many cases, people like me who grew up in the US really experienced the reverberations of the hostility towards Iran as a result of the hostage crisis. And in some senses, that event of the hostage crisis really cemented for Iranian Americans the attitude that we still live with. I don't know if it's so bad in Canada, but in the US, really the beginning of the 21st century was really marked by this very hostile relationship between the US and Iran, and the kind of defensiveness that many Iranians felt about their heritage and about the way it was portrayed in the media. So that first collection, in some senses, I think was people coming out of the sense of quiet shame and denial and beginning to really start to articulate their experiences and their stories and coming to grips with also being in the United States and recognizing that they probably were not going to go back to Iran, that in fact many people were coming to grips with the idea of either being exiles or unwilling immigrants to the United States, and some more willing, of course. The second collection, which is outside, so that was in 1999, and it was sort of an accident of my own literary desire that anthology came out. But in 2006, I published a second collection. And one of the things that was so interesting about the first collection was that it was 32 authors, and of those 32 authors, only 4 were men. So what I really started to understand was that Iranian women and the second generation Iranian Americans were really dominating this new literature of diaspora. And to some degree, that is a reflection of how in Iran, men dominated the literary scene as well. But what became really apparent to me was that women who were immigrating to the United States were really passionate about taking up this literary space that was not necessarily very available to them in Iran, but there were no limits on what they could do here in the US. So the opportunity came to me that I should actually collect some of these writers, and I had a student who said, let's do one that's focusing on women's writing. And again, I sent out a call for submissions and just got hundreds and hundreds of submissions by women, lots of stories and poems. And at this point, this is the beginning of the 2000s, what we also saw was the phenomenon of Iranian women's memoirs being published, lots of them, right? Tara Barampour's To See and See Again, Azadeh Moaveni's Lipstick Jihad, Azar Nafisi's, thank you, Reading Lolita in Tehran. And there was essentially a kind of fascination and interest on the part of particularly the US publishing industry with the idea of memoir, Iranian women's memoir, this sort of exoticization also of Iranian women. And the publication of these memoirs, I think, was a byproduct of kind of a collaboration between publishing houses who had a particular attitude about Iranian women and the veil, but also the fact that Iranian women were definitely writing about themselves in the autobiographical first-person I. And as you all know, that idea of the narrative I, writing about oneself, is not something that was exactly encouraged in Iran. People wrote either fiction or biographies, but it wasn't encouraged to write from the point of view of one's individual narrative person. So that was another phenomenon that I noticed, that women were beginning to write a lot about themselves, a lot about their experiences of growing up in Iran. And I thought I would read you a short little excerpt from Tara Barampour's memoir, because I think in a way it reflects also another phenomenon, which was that at the beginning of the 2000s, people were going back to Iran. There was a surge in young Iranian Americans and even Iranian Canadians who were going back to Iran to sort of reconnect with Iran, and were discovering that even though they had spent a formidable time in their life in Iran, they didn't quite feel Iranian anymore when they went back because so much had changed. So this is a little excerpt from Tara Barampour's To See and See Again, and I like it because it kind of reflects her nostalgia both for what she remembered about Iran and also what was impossible to have now that she had left Iran. I bent down my hand and trailed it in the cold river, letting my fingers sway like the roots along the bank. This was the river I had walked along as a child, the river Baba had fished in, the river Agha Jan's first wife had crossed on the Qajar jeweled horse that carried her over the hill to her new life. Our own new lives, Baba's and my own, strayed far from this river, but for those who stayed, life retained a continuity that cannot be found anywhere else. I can see it in their faces, in the wonder-struck eyes of Amejun when she finds the son of her childhood playmate, in the pleased recognition in Ami's eyes when she pins her Kurdish clothes on me, in Layla's appreciative smile when she runs her hand up my thigh and tells me to marry Mehdi. All this touching between women bothered Mama when she was in Iran. She hated the way after lunch the women would go off and take naps together, massaging each other's sore legs, braiding each other's hair, plucking each other's eyebrows, and smoothing ointment on afterward. She found these rituals intrusive. Her mother was American, especially when coupled with sexual jokes and insinuations that pass between giggling married women, jokes designed to be tantalizingly inscrutable to unmarried girls who might be listening. But none of this bothers me. I like the slightly bawdy banter among women in my family. I like the touching. It reminds me of the way I used to touch my friends and cousins before a sixth grader in America warned me not to. Once in America, I forgot the pleasure of casually entwined fingers or arms linked together in friendship. I strictly followed the rules of American adolescence and made it clear to my family that kissing me was no longer acceptable. Physicality became confined to romance, and it was many years before I began to remember the comfort that comes with owning and being owned by a large, affectionate clan. Now back in it again, I have the sense that this is not just me they are touching. Running her hand up my thigh, Leila Khanum is also touching her own remembered self, and this is part of her pleasure. Every girl is a version of the woman, every woman a model for what the girl will someday be. And at the end of the day, when the sun has set and everyone has helped with the apple harvesting and the baking of bread and cooking of dinner, the candlelight flickers over the faces and the differences are smoothed away. If I were to stay here, I would probably be only partly satisfied. I would always feel I belonged. I would always feel glad to run into those old ladies who remembered the child my father was. But being away from America, I might also start to feel more American, more trapped. I might become impatient with the old ladies' talk of marriage and deaths and old property squabbles and start missing the other kind of old lady, the book-reading, hiking and swimming old lady that I imagine my mother will be and that I want to be too. An old lady who might live far from Iran but would bring her grandchildren back here to discover the places from their past that don't change no matter who comes or goes. 50 years from now, they would find the same cool river and the same smell of mountain grass. They would find a row of white poplars glowing in the sunset and a husband and wife who laughed as they grabbed at each other under the cows. And inside the house, in a fire in the grate, a table laden with fresh cutlets and yogurt, and a basket full of mint from a rained-on garden. So I wanted to read you that just to show you a little bit about some of the nostalgia that has been a part of some of these memoirs, a nostalgia for an Iran that either is lost, no longer there, or that has in some ways been cut off for people once they came to the United States and had a whole second life. And we were talking at dinner also about, that a person can be shaped in their childhood by a place like Iran and then live 2, 3, 4, 5 decades and still really hold on to the memory and the kind of experience of a culture and a life in another place like Iran. And those memoirs, I think, to a great extent, reflect some of that mood. And I just saw Nima walk in. Nima Naqibi, my friend and a scholar at Ryerson, is coming out with a book about Iranian women's memoirs. So hopefully she'll come here and talk to you about that in greater depth. So this development of memoirs, I think, was really important in the sort of development of Iranian American literature because in some senses you have the first generation which is coming to grips with leaving Iran, a kind of sense of loss and rupture, and then the second generation of writers, or the second movement of writers, is really that first person sort of claiming a voice, both a literary voice, but also a sense of belonging here and being able to write about the in-between of being Iranian and American. And a lot of those memoirs were really important for readers because they introduced Iran to many readers. And one could argue they also mimicked each other a lot. So some of the memoirs you'll see are similar. They have lots of similar themes. There's also the captivity narratives, people who were jailed in Iran, journalists. So you have Roxana Saberi, who's a radio journalist, Haleh Esfandiari, and the 3 Americans who were jailed in Iran, Maziar Bahari's book. Those also, I think, are really interesting to read because they are part of this this genre of the memoir, and in some senses reflect a very conflicted relationship with Iran because of their experience of being detained in Iranian prisons, often in Evin. For me also, the other really interesting phenomenon is to look at what happened to Iranian Americans after 9/11 in the US, and again, a little different for Canadians, but Iranians sort of experienced a kind of second trauma after 9/11 because they were essentially, collapsed into that larger experience of Muslim Americans who were looked upon with suspicion. In some senses, the same negative feelings towards Iranians was cast all over again towards Arab Americans, but Iranians were part of that as well. And you have a lot of writing that is in some ways speaking to now the experience of Iranians who see themselves as outsiders all over again in the US context. And at the same time, there's also, after memoir, there's an emergence of fiction. And I attribute that to a couple things. One is the memoir, the Iranian memoir was sort of saturated and the publishing market didn't want to publish anymore. And you have the next generation of young people, many of whom are going to university, many of whom are studying the humanities, creative writing, and writing now fiction. And the third collection that I worked on, called Tremors, New Fiction by Iranian American Writers, is partly a reflection of this idea that people often, it takes several generations or several literary moments before people actually get to writing fiction. They have the need to write their own stories, and then they become more confident writers, they become more accomplished in English. Iranians always have an attraction to poetry, so it never goes away. There's still a lot of really good, interesting poetry by Iranian writers and Iranian American writers. But I would say there's been an explosion of fiction writing. And that writing, to a great extent, is the stories that are embodied in all of us. Stories of leaving Iran, stories of growing up in Iran. Lots of Jewish Iranian writers have been writing about the experience of growing up as Jews, both in Iran and in the US context, and navigating sort of some of their minority status within the Iranian community. We have a story in here by a Baha'i writer as well. The fiction, I think, is really, really very good. And for me, it's very exciting to see the movement away from memoir towards fiction, because I think to a great extent, Iranians had a kind of post-traumatic experience after the revolution that kind of self-silenced people, that made people a little bit afraid to speak and write, and uncomfortable with talking about difficult subjects. So a lot of the fiction that I see now, people are tackling really interesting subjects: sexuality, love, intergenerational conflict, marriage between different religious groups, racism within the Iranian community itself. So I see fiction as this sort of more playful ground where people are writing about things that they've been perhaps a little more afraid to write about in the past. And a lot more comfort with the idea of being both Iranian and American, or straddling those cultures and feeling like the in-between is where they belong. So I thought maybe I'd read a few more pieces, and I'm really interested in having a discussion, so I don't want to spend too much time talking, but I thought I would read a few pieces from both books. And since I'm in Canada, I have to read this poem. It's a prose poem by my friend Sholeh Wolpe called My Brother at the Canadian Border. And it's for her brother Omid. On their way to Canada in a red Mazda, my brother and his friend, PhDs and little stents, stopped at the border, and the guard leaned forward, asked, "Where are you boys heading?" My brother, welcome to Canada, poster not, his eyes replied, "Mexico." The guard blinked, stepped back, then forward, said, "Sir, this is the Canadian border." My brother turned to his friend, grabbed the map from his hand, slammed it on his shaved head. "You stupid idiot," he yelled. you've been holding the map upside down. In the interrogation room full of metal desks and chairs with wheels that squeaked and fluorescent light humming, bombarded with questions, and finally, race? Stymied, my brother confessed, I really don't know, my parents never said. And the woman behind the desk widened her blue eyes to take in my brother's olive skin, hazel eyes, the blonde fur that covered his arms and legs, disappearing behind a plastic partition. She returned with a dusty book, thick as War and Peace, said, this will tell us your race. Where was your father born? She asked, putting on her horn-rimmed glasses. Persia, he said. Do you mean Iran? I ran, you ran, we all ran, he smiled. Where's your mother from? Voice cold as a gun. Russia, he replied. She put one finger on a word above a chart in the book, the other on a word at the bottom of the page, brought them together, looking like a mad mathematician bent on solving the crime of 0 times 0 divided by 1. Her fingers stopped on a word, declared, you are white. My brother stumbled back, a hand on his chest, eyes wide, mouth in an O, as in, oh my God, all these years and I did not know. Then to the room, to the woman in the guards. I am white. I can go anywhere, do anything. I can go to Canada and pretend it's Mexico. At last, I am white, and you have no reason to keep me here. This is a poem by Susan Attefat Peckham. She was an Iranian American poet. Sadly, she died in a car accident in 2003 in Jordan. But I have a series of poems that her husband gave to me after she died in this collection. And she won an award. I can't remember what it was called, but it was a poetry award. And so I wanted to honor her for the poems she wrote. And this one is called For Tradition. I struggled with my grandmother's rose bush, pinching and bending branches, picking each red and yellow petal from tender stems. I pushed them into a glass of water, set on the cement ledge, and waited patiently in her lap, lacing my inked fingers around her neck, stroking the flush skin, watching the calluses on a soldier's hands through a space in the gate, and wondered if his twitching fingers could reach the glass. I now see the deep lines in her forehead, and a whispered prayer plays on her wrinkled lips. She holds the Quran to my swelling mouth, waiting for me, a woman now, to kiss the ruffled pages and pass under its broken spine. I hear her, full with care, spill the water at the gate and drop warm petals. For tradition, she says, for my quick return, as if the trail smeared in the mortar behind the car made a difference, as if a kiss on the holy book would keep us safe. I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote called Pomegranates, because I'm from California where we have lots of pomegranates. And I'll just tell you a little story about why I wrote this poem. The first collection, A World Between, I gave to my cousin who's a painter, and I said, Marjan, can you make a cover for me? And she read the manuscript, and she noticed that there was about 6 or 7 poems or stories that referenced a pomegranate. And she said, you know, Iranians are really crazy about pomegranates. And I said, yes, they are. And so she made a beautiful cover. I wish I had it to show you. And it had a pomegranate on the cover. And after that book came out, lots of people told me, oh, I love the cover of the book. And then people would send me pomegranate postcards and pomegranate jewelry, and I got a few little sculptures. And it was, suddenly I was the anointed queen of the pomegranate. I'm wearing a pomegranate on my neck. So I decided I should write a poem about pomegranates for all the pomegranate lovers in the Iranian community. So this is called Pomegranates. And it's in memory of my Baba, who taught me how to appreciate pomegranates. To root themselves in their new home, Mother and Baba planted native trees, madrone, oak, and the manzanita at the end of the drive. To remind them of their foreignness, they planted olive, almond, quince, pomegranate. The first time my mother packed one in my lunch, I shrank in embarrassment, quickly returning the leathery bulb to the brown bag. how to eat a pomegranate without being conspicuous. It is a slow and exacting endeavor, an act of worship. You never slice them with a knife, Baba would say, when the September heat made the trees sag with the ornaments of autumn. In his world, men sold them on the streets for a few tumans, shouting, "Anare khoshmazeh," delicious pomegranates, rolling the sun-flushed hides between two palms. Customers at the corner of a cart kneaded, coaxed the last of the blood-red juice from a hole, allowing it to touch only their lips. Our American sensibility refused this technique. We never took their exotic form for granted. "Throw them in the air, let them crack open," my brothers yelled, waiting for the quiet thud and then the invisible seam that split them open like an unhealed wound. We liked the splatter of color on face and hands, evidence of pomegranate carnage. In my 20s, I finally understood the fecund symbol. A magazine in the chiropractor's office advised women wanting to conceive, eat estrogen-rich foods, shrimp, scallops, pomegranates. Like the larvae of some magical butterfly, the red ovules offered a cure for barren women. There are two kinds of people in the world: those who pluck the seeds from the waxy yellow membrane, tossing them into their mouths, and those who hoard the ruby jewels, jealously guarding the pile until the last kernel is extracted. Once in a child's game of war, my brother plucked a pomegranate, tore its feathery crown, and with a heave mimicked the sound of a grenade exploding with his mouth full of saliva. "Bury it," I said, looking at its inedible remains. Baba would not tolerate such sacrilege. When I learned a Sephardic version of the fall, that it was a pomegranate and not an apple, I felt a kind of secret pride. "It's too cold for apples in the Garden of Eden," I told a friend. This fall, my 2-year-old son, undaunted, eats his first pomegranate. His tiny, probing fingers harvest the seeds one by one. With hands stained by this baptism, he offers them to me like the remnants of an untold story inherited in the womb. For many of us, food was the first contact with Iranian culture, those of us who were not as immediately connected to Iran. So as a child, my parents would go to the foothills of California and get a lamb slaughtered, and then we'd bring it home and put it in the freezer. So I always ate lamb as a kid and rice, but we also ate a lot of eggplant. And because I grew up before the big mass migration of Iranians, I felt like a real oddball because we would eat lamb and eggplant and pomegranates, things that many Americans never ate. And this is called Ode to the Eggplant. And I wrote this one. I was trying to get my stepson to appreciate eggplants, and he didn't really understand them. He said, "I don't understand eggplants." So this is for him. A much misunderstood creature, the eggplant is like an exile, the tongue of its deep purple mouth trapped in the bitterness of those who cannot speak. Poor eggplant, even your name compromises your beauty. Like a wayward traveler arriving at Ellis Island, someone took a look at you and declared eggplant. If only they'd spoken French and written down aubergine instead. Your American name belies your mystery. You are an egg, yes, but also the curve of a human calf, a shiny black phallus in the starkness of day. You are the waxy underbelly of a bird, the slope of a mountain, smooth stones from the bottom of a river. How could anyone have missed your taste in the appellation? You are neither animal nor vegetable, but your flavor is requited love, the thing that makes all others complete. Garlic, tomato, lentil, lamb, rice, olive oil would simply be lost without you. And the heat from which you are born is the heat you unleash in the slow simmer of sauce and stew that gathers people to an intimate table. I can't resist. I'm going to read you a poem about big noses, since all of you can appreciate the beauty of a big Iranian nose. And I hope I don't offend anybody. Please don't take it as offensive at all. It's called In Praise of Big Noses. And this part is true, the first line. I am the only one of 4 sisters who hasn't gone under the knife. I resisted the pleas of my aunt and sisters to become more beautiful, more you. I've kept my stately proboscis intact, choosing not to excise its grandeur. It suits me, I suppose, evidence of my father, those people who live in the drier, hotter climes of the Mediterranean, in high desert plateaus, cooling themselves with nasothermoregulation. My old Jewish boyfriend used to say, how do the Goyim breathe from those things anyway? On my wedding day, my husband, also Jewish and rather plentiful in that region of his face, completed his vows by saying, there is no guarantee in love, but of this I am certain. If we have a child, he or she will have a really big nose. When I nuzzle him with mine, he pulls back his face, jumps at the coldness of its tip. Contrary to popular belief, the nose is not merely cosmetic. It can gauge temperature beyond the body. And that's another thing I've realized about the nose, that smell is an underrated sense, perhaps a gift. Imagine the possibilities for amplification. Aromas of jasmine, apple pie, saffron, lemon, rose might grow more intense depending on the height and angle of that fleshy mound. I admit to having no scientific evidence for this, but I do wonder what happens when a person alters the things with which they are born. Whole industries were born from Iranian women watching blonde, petite-nosed movie stars who made them forget their own striking beauty. Took thousands of years to evolve, only to be undone by someone who decided that hairless, plucked, tucked, sliced, nipped, and trimmed were loveliest of all. I like to think of the nose as great art, waiting to be discovered, like large-nosed kings depicted on the sides of temples, on papyrus, on caves, in colorful Mayan pictographs like Popol Vuh. Noses were signs of nobility and prowess. Any king with a puny one might have been thought of as small and impotent. These days, I get a steady stream of emails offering penis enlargement, but that's hidden, visible only in bedroom interludes. The nose is the public display of one's endowments, the relief map of a human face. I study people's noses in order to read their origins, to situate my gaze, to find out how far in the world they really are. So that was just a little sampling of poetry. I'm going to read you a couple prose pieces from Tremors, just to give you a sense of some of the diverse voices. I'm going to read you a little piece from my friend Ari's piece called The Ascension, Meraj. Tremors is divided into 3 sections. The first section is called American Homeland, which are really reflecting the perspective of Iranian Americans. The second section is called Iran, Land of Resilience. They're stories that are situated in Iran. And then the third section is called Other Land. And that section has stories that are in some ways really influenced by being Iranian, but don't speak to it directly. So this is Ari Saletz's The Ascension. And I'll just read you an excerpt. Aunt Tamine somehow knew she would remain barren until she found a name for her future child. So for the first 15 years of her marriage, she and her husband fought over what they would call their as yet to be conceived offspring. She liked authentic Iranian names like Kurosh, Parvaneh, and Kevan, while her husband, a religious man, insisted on a Quranic name like Mohammed, Ali, or Fatimeh. Finally, they came to an agreement. If the child was a girl, they would name her Farangis, after an ancient Iranian heroine, and if it was a boy, they would name him Ismail, a Quranic name which also appears in the Bible as Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and means God listens. Presumably, God listens to us and has answered our prayer for a child. But when Ismail was born, it turned out that God hadn't listened very well. The infant came out of the womb so blue and sickly that the family doctor gave him no chance of surviving the night. But Aunt Tamine had also called a midwife to the birthing, and this midwife thought otherwise. "This isn't your child, dear," she told the exhausted Tahmineh. "It belongs to a mother jinn. The jealous jinn has swapped your beautiful, healthy baby with her own sickly child. You must return this infant to the jinn and get your own baby back." So the midwife wrapped the newborn in warm clothes and took him out to the far side of their property, where she placed him on the floor of the outhouse and closed the door. This act would let the jinn mother know that Aunt Tahmineh had not been fooled by the swap. But the old doctor knew that the outcome of this ritual would not produce a healthy baby. Infants with the same condition with which Ismail was born usually only lived hours. Yet he humored the midwife's far-fetched wisdom and surmised that taking the baby from Aunt Tahmineh's arms would disrupt any parental bonding and shorten the mother's grief. Throughout the night, the entire family, the parents, aunts and uncles, and grandparents stayed awake to keep vigil in hopes that the healthy baby would be returned to the outhouse. At sunrise, the midwife went to fetch the infant, while Aunt Tahmineh's sisters consoled her and prepared her for the news. Like petals falling on a garden stone, their words of anticipatory comfort did nothing to break the impermeable resignation of Aunt Tahmineh's face. Hearing the midwife's returning footsteps, everyone braced for the grief and wailing. They were quite unprepared for what they saw. The midwife stopped at the door jamb, looking as though something had struck her. Her puzzled state was directed at the doctor. It took him a moment to overcome his disbelief that inside the bundle was a living thing. He then leapt up, snatched the bundle from the midwife, and began frantically to unwrap the blanket. No one could have known how tenaciously the infant would cling to life and survive the night in the outhouse. The parents were assured by the midwife that the jinn had swapped back her baby with the sickly one. This baby just needed to be nursed back to health after the trauma of the kidnapping. Looking at the baby's face, Aunt Tahmineh and her husband accepted him, of course, but instead of naming him Ismail, they decided to name him Nader, a nice Arabic name that refers to things that are difficult to find, like diamonds or geniuses. Events that are nader are great victories, big inventions, or the ultimate nader, the appearance of a messiah. But there is nothing that says the word nader and precious must go together. Nader simply by itself means rare and unusual. Applied to my cousin, however, it could have just as easily meant oddball. Did his parents mean to name him Oddball? Another interpretation of the name might be that they intended to name him Nader after the powerful Iranian conqueror who invaded India and looted its treasures. One such treasure was the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the mountain of light, which I once saw in a museum in Britain. A diamond reminded me of a precious stolen object, as in a healthy baby named Ishmael, kidnapped by a jinn. A few of the relatives grumbled that it was bad luck to slight the answer to prayer. They felt Aunt Tahmineh and her husband were breaking a covenant with God by not giving the boy the promised name, God listens. God had listened. At Tahmineh's age, conception was a wonder. Giving birth to a live child, however sickly, was a miracle. What did she expect? Of course, the relatives were being unfair to Nader's parents. Aunt Tahmineh and her husband tried their best to love the child they had prayed for, but it was as though God was deliberately making it difficult. I remember one day Nader's father, my uncle, was wiping his thick glasses with his handkerchief. Any time my uncle cried, he used to take off his glasses and keep wiping them, as though the tears were coming from his own spectacles. He was wiping and wiping because Nader had come down with typhoid fever. The child was so hot you could blister your hands touching him. Aunt Tahmineh's servant woman told us how Nader's bed sheets had scorch marks on them the next day, and immediately followed by saying that it wasn't possible to survive such a high fever. That night, my uncle stood outside the door, red-eyed, wiping his glasses. He was angrily explaining his frustration to my mother. How many times must I say goodbye to my son? The first year he can't breathe, the next year it's his heart, then he falls on his head, after that it's the rabies shots, not to mention the blood poisoning. Then it's this illness, then it's that accident. How many times, I ask you, when Father Abraham went to sacrifice his son and God said it was all right, his son didn't have to die. Suppose the next day God kicks Abraham awake and says, guess what, I'm God and I've changed my mind, your son must die. So Father Abraham takes the child to the rock, ties him up again, and is ready to make the sacrifice when God says, it's okay, he can live. And the next day the same, and the next day over and over. I don't want to say anything blasphemous, but even Father Abraham would go insane and make the sacrifice anyway just because he couldn't take the prospect of losing his child anymore. I mean, enough is enough. Actually, I couldn't possibly be remembering this episode because I hadn't been born yet. Nader is 6 years older than I, and he had typhoid fever when he was 5. My mother must have told me this story when I was so young that it feels like it's my own memory. Anyway, the point is that it wasn't that his parents didn't love him, it's just that they had gone insane and already sacrificed him. And the metaphor is accurate, because in the Muslim tradition, it is Ismail, not Isaac, that God demands in the sacrifice story. Isaac hadn't been born yet. Everybody wants to apply the magic of Abraham's covenant to their own mythological ancestor, because more than anything, to be fruitful and multiply means that our offspring will survive. The covenant is like a charm around our child's necks. Anytime we fear that God is going to foreclose on a young life, we pull out that contract and show God where it says that the brave ancestor Abraham has already settled that account. I think I'll stop there and encourage you to get the book so you can read. Ari is working on a series of stories about jinn in the Iranian tradition. And I wanted to read you that because one of the things that's really interesting is a lot of these writers are now investigating myths and stories from their family's storytelling tradition and putting it into fiction. And there's a lot of new writing that I think is reflecting some of that idea of the myth that you hear in your own family about a particular person, or the ways in which it's infused with other myths and stories. I'm just going to end with reading you a little piece of a story I wrote for this collection called Something to Pray For. It's about an older gentleman, Iranian gentleman, and this is based on a true story. After 9/11, John Ashcroft, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, was encouraging the arrest of Arabs and Muslims across the United States, under a suspicion that either Iranian or Arab communities were harboring potential terrorists. And it was a pretty scary time in the U.S. because people were attacked simply because of how they looked. So this was a story based on a call for Iranians in Los Angeles, or people from the countries of Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Iran, Iraq, to come and register. So they had to show their papers, and a lot of people went to, it was called the INS back then, now it's called the ICE, the Immigration Service, and to register and show that they were legal. And the INS detained about 350 men for several days without cause, and including quite a few Iranians, about 200 Iranians. And they were detained without cause, and there was a lot of protests. And for me, it was a really telling moment in which Iran suddenly were thrust back to that time after the hostage crisis when they were so suspect. So this is a story, a fictionalized story about a man named Mohsen who ends up in the jail. Mohsen hadn't remembered to put his cell phone in his pocket that day. His wife usually insisted that he carry it with him at all times, even though he rarely turned it on. He was a product of another time. Letters and personal visits over tea were still part of his life, even in his adopted country. But now, sitting on the cold concrete floor in a jail cell crowded with what seemed like hundreds of men, he imagined how comforting it would be to speak with his wife or his son, Ehsan, who had recently finished law school. "Sir,"